So we're dropped back into the ancient world again, where we drop ourselves pretty regularly in order to encounter sacred texts and narratives that not only have deeply formed Western culture, but often our own inner spiritual landscapes. So where's Jesus in your spiritual landscape, if at all? He must be there, no matter what our past or our upbringing or our avoidance of the ways that he's been co-opted and pressed into service in harmful ways. Jesus is invoked constantly and publicly in this country, and the Christian tradition permeates even our secular culture, so that even an intentionally non-religious person can't help but become somewhat acquainted with the key points of the Christian story through songs, art, literature, holidays that sort of straddle the consumeristic and the mystical, like Easter's funny mashup of resurrection and chocolate Cadbury eggs. I asked the class last week, we gathered for our first session of Encountering Jesus, and I asked the class, first question, I said, who is Jesus for you? And we sat in silence for a minute, and somebody went, huh. And we responded in various ways. He is beloved. He is a problem. He's an invitation. He's an irritating remnant from a less enlightened time. He's an admirable man, a great guy, someone said. He is a teacher. Once upon a time, in first century Palestine, a man named Jesus came onto a historical scene that was quite populated with other Jewish messianic figures, claiming to be the ones whom you should follow. The one who had the direct through line to God and God's wisdom, the God of Israel who was going to deliver his people from oppression under the Roman Empire and usher in a kingdom, a new realm of glory. God will wipe away every tear from every eye, the prophets of old had written. God will beat swords into plowshares. These Messiah wannabes stood in line with those great prophets. And Jesus was one of those who similarly preached and worked healing miracles and gathered huge crowds around him as word of his oratorical brilliance, his ability to interpret scripture, and his ability to heal the possessed and the sick spread. As we know, because we can skip ahead to the events culminating this Friday, which we call Good Friday, we know that Jesus of Nazareth failed in his job definition, which, as my seminary professor Joanna Dewey memorably said, was to overthrow the Roman Empire, not be executed by it. But as I have seen written recently, they thought they buried him. In fact, they planted him. In the Universalist heritage that is our theological inheritance, Jesus was the living revelation of, in the words of one of our 19th century professions of faith, the one God whose nature is love. I don't know if the other Messiah contenders who lived in Jesus' time revealed God's love as deeply as did Jesus. My little knowledge of them is that they focused more on the world to come or on organizing resistance in the current world. They didn't merit more than much of a mention in the history books. It's Jesus whom we have remembered, and Jesus' meaning with which we have grappled and wrestled for over 2,000 years in the Western world. And of course, Christianity is now a global religion. So we come to Palm Sunday again as one of the moments in the year when we receive Jesus again as a guest or as a friend, or we have traveled with him all along, and we learn from him and from the example of his life. Today we meet him at the end of his earthly ministry when he is still the historical Jesus before he becomes the post-Easter Christ of faith. He's been giving teachings that upend what the priests and keepers of the Torah law have said and insisted upon. For instance, feeding hungry people or healing them on the Sabbath upon which we are forbidden to do any work, even laying on of hands to cure the suffering. But Jesus has been laying on of hands on the Sabbath, and Jesus has been laying out a new philosophy, still grounded in his Jewish religion, but with a new emphasis on solidarity, egalitarianism, and above all, compassion. He has had crowds gathering around him everywhere he goes. He's renowned. He has spoken in weird, mysterious little stories that have clever multiple meanings and inside jokes. He has raised the dead. He has opened a wine bar at a wedding at the urging of his mom. He has expressed his grief over Jerusalem, not just the actual literal city of Jerusalem, but the symbolic holy city that is being defiled by Roman occupation and threatened by the Roman Empire. And he has repeatedly emphasized a concept of wholeness, shalom, and peace that is unrelated to external circumstances. Peace that is not the result of the calm that comes with everything in life turning out well, not the peace that comes when fortunes favor us, but the peace of inner integrity, the peace, the shalom, the wholeness of being in right relation with oneself, one's God, and with others. The extraordinary drama of the story of Jesus of Nazareth is not just in his person and in his activities and in his enigmatic presence and remarkable nature, but in his historical context, that everything that he's doing is in violation of his social order. He's a poor Jew, a member of a permanent underclass, who is claiming to be a mediator between humans and God, and speaking and living with authority and fearless dignity. He is a kosher Jew who is breaking Levitical dietary and purity laws constantly, and I could give you a really long laundry list of examples. He breaks laws and traditions relating to food and women and money. So he is in trouble. He's not just unpopular with the temple authorities, with the priestly authorities, who are threatened by his non-traditional ministry and his claiming of authority and his frequent thumb in their eye. There's actually a much more dangerous level of authority over that authority, whose eyes are always upon him. We must remember that in announcing the kingdom of God, Jesus was promising a demolition of the present order and the powers and agents of that present order that is the Roman Empire. His promise to the oppressed was a threat to the privileged. I want to read a little bit more of Walter Brueggemann. Jesus' message was to the poor, but others kept them poor and benefited from their poverty. He addressed the captives, which means for his time bonded slaves, but others surely wanted that arrangement unchanged. He named the oppressed, but there are never oppressed without oppressors. Hey, nothing's changed. The ministry of Jesus, and this is Brueggemann still, the ministry of Jesus is, of course, criticism that leads to radical dismantling, and as is characteristic, the guardians and profiteers of the present stability are acutely sensitive to any change that may question or challenge the present arrangement. And I had to share that reading with you because, again, hey, nothing's changed, okay? radical dismantling. At this point in the narrative, what we commemorate today is Jesus riding with his followers into the holy city of Jerusalem on that donkey or that colt, it depends which narrative you hear, where he's going to directly confront the power holders in the temple. And we immediately get, you know what he does first when he gets to Jerusalem? He goes into the temple and has the cleansing of the temple scene, throwing over the tables and getting rid of all the, criticizing the commerce that's going on in there, a brisk business. I want you to picture, though, not just the temple authorities, the Jewish temple authorities who are really dismayed by this, but please remember the Roman surveillance that's watching that, okay? So we need to imagine really in our modern day context or equivalent, police with riot gear and tanks and tear gas at the ready, waiting behind the ecstatic Jewish fans of Jesus who are shouting, Hosanna, and waving palms as he rides into the city. They're there all the time. This is a loud but nonviolent protest, and they're still there. They're ready with their tanks and their tear gas. And Jesus knew. He knew. He took it on. Every Jewish rebellion or uprising in his time and before that, no matter how insignificant, had been brutally suppressed by the Roman police state. And Jesus and his followers would have themselves seen many public crucifixions that were so prevalent as a form of public crime deterrence and social control. So how does Jesus, knowing the inevitable outcome of his actions, in full view of two layers of political powers who are threatened by him, strategize with his team? What does he do? He gets to Jerusalem, to the temple, and first he throws tables down in the temple and denounces the money changers. And then he gives a lot of teachings, and during which he predicts the destruction of the temple, which in fact was to happen soon thereafter, about 70 years after his life began. Jesus is going to try to impress upon those around him that they need to be prepared for the coming trial. And that's not a legal trial, but like trials and tribulations trials. But what does he not do? What does he not do to strategize with his folks? Well, he does not, and this is a disappointment to many of them, and to Judas, he doesn't strategize in a military way. He doesn't try to organize a military coup. He does not assign captains or chiefs. He doesn't raise money, and he doesn't make a business plan. He doesn't rent a property or buy one, although he had supporters who could have done that for him had he said the word. What does he do? Well, for one thing, he prays. He centers himself always by withdrawing from the crowd for what will be a harrowing and heartbreaking end. He gets his disciples together for a meal in a secret location so that he can minister to them as a distinct group away from the crowds. In the upper room of legend, Jesus sits with his nearest and dearest, and he shares a meal with them. And this is his strategy, to instill among his immediate community a sense of his own clarity and peace and self-sacrificing love in the simple act of eating bread and drinking wine, so that they can remember and return to this moment in the devastating, tumultuous, physically, emotionally, and spiritually demanding days to come. These people, men and women, have their beloved teacher's brutal execution to endure soon, and Jesus knows that, because he knows how the Roman Empire works and what happens to people like him, and because he's not going to try to avoid it. He is more concerned with their spiritual solidarity with him and each other through what is to come than he is with his own horrible fate, although he will express grief and fear for himself too, which makes his gift of peace and the promise that he will be present in the bread and the wine and any time that they gather even more poignant. I will be with you to the end of time, wherever a few of you are gathered. In my name, I'm going to be there. As often as you do this in memory of me, he says, and he passes the matzah. This is me with you, in the bread and in the cup. Those who embrace Jesus as teacher, as reformer, as human exemplar, let us take heed here. Let us take note that this most holy of persons, this friend to all who engage in the struggle, this lover of souls, in preparing his community and by extension through time, our own, bestowed upon all who will receive it the gift of peace, not of belief, not even of good fortune, not of ease, not of exemption from pain or from suffering, but the peace that passeth understanding. Peace I leave with you, he said. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, nor let it be afraid.